Citizen protest has become a common occurrence in the United States, especially after the enactment of the First Amendment, which gives people the right to freedom of speech and assembly. However, this amendment has been restricted by the government, and more specifically the Supreme Court. This idea of government control is expanded upon in the stimulus material, 40% of millennials okay with limiting speech offensive to minorities, by Jacob Poster. In his article, he discusses how the majority of millennials do not want their freedom of speech limited and believe they should be able to say things offensive to minorities. In Francine Prost's article, When Librarians Are Silenced, she discusses the idea of excessive police force. This led me to the question, to what extent do Supreme Court restrictions of the First Amendment impact treatment of African Americans by the police? This is a current problem in the United States due to various examples of police brutality towards African American citizens. After conducting further research, I've been led to the conclusion that Supreme Court restrictions of the First Amendment create unfair court rulings as well as a general distrust towards the police from African Americans. In explaining the Supreme Court restrictions, they have basically limited the First Amendment so that people can be arrested for illegal protests based on the time, place, and manner of the protests they are taking part in. This has led to various unfair court rulings because of the Supreme Court's own interpretation of the law. An example of this was in the Whitney v. California case. Charlotte Whitney was convicted of supporting a communist party and was taken to court. Defense attorney Justice Louis Brandeis argued, citizens have an obligation to take part in the governing process, and they cannot do that without their right to freedom of speech. Despite this valid argument, Whitney was still convicted, and this is one example of an unfair court ruling. Supreme Court restrictions have also led to a general distrust towards the police officers from the African American community. An article from the NORC Center for Public Affairs at the University of Chicago conducted multiple polls surveying whites, blacks, and Hispanics. One of these polls was asking them how likely they are to trust the police in any given situation. The results are shown in this graph. As you can see, whites are the most likely to always trust the police, while African Americans are the most likely to rarely or never trust the police. This viewpoint has been caused by past actions, such as the beating of Rodney King, which led to his eventual death. A possible solution is to prevent the Supreme Court from enacting their own laws. This would be extremely effective, however, it is not feasible. Doing this would entail taking away most of the Supreme Court's power, which would not be well accepted and would only lead to further disputes within the government. Instead, my recommendation is that police officers should be required to wear body cameras at all times. An article by Cato Institute said, by recording police-citizen encounters, police supervisors, judges, reporters, and others can get objective evidence instead of self-serving hearsay. They also conducted a study with 988 officers. 489 were told to wear body cameras over a period of 6 months, and the other 499 did not. The results were convincing, as acts of violence against African Americans went from 22% to as little as 1%. Enacting this solution would require certain policies to be put in place to protect police officers' right to privacy. However, if this is done, it would allow the Supreme Court to keep their restrictions but provide evidence for fair rulings to be made in the future.